The dust of the trail clung to Winifred Ross's skirts as she stood before the post office in Dalhart, Texas, clutching the bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. 12 letters she'd written over 12 months. All returned unopened, the seals unbroken and her heart along with them. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as the postmaster, a man with sympathetic eyes beneath bushy brows, handed back the 12th letter with the same apologetic look he'd given her 11 times before. "I'm sorry, Miss Ross," he said, his voice low. "Mr. Blackwell still refuses delivery." Winifred nodded, fighting back the sting of tears that threatened to spill. At 22, she'd wasted 2 years of her life loving a man who'd promised her everything, then disappeared to Boston without a backward glance. The humiliation burned hotter than the Texas sun. "Thank you, Mr. Phillips," she replied, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "I won't be troubling you with any more letters." As she turned to leave, the door to the post office swung open, bringing with it a gust of hot air and the imposing figure of Ethan Quinn. At 30, he was Dalhart's most respected rancher, a man of few words and many acres. His Rocking Q ranch employed half the men in the county, and his presence commanded the attention of everyone in the small post office. "Miss Ross," he said with a slight tip of his hat, revealing just a glimpse of dark hair beneath. His eyes, the color of a storm-washed sky, briefly met hers before noticing the bundle of letters clutched against her chest. Winifred nodded politely and made to step around him, but his voice stopped her. "Those yours?" he asked, gesturing toward the letters with a sun-bronzed hand. "Yes, Mr. Quinn," she answered, instinctively pulling them closer. "Though it seems they're unwanted." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of understanding, perhaps even anger. Ethan Quinn wasn't known for involving himself in others' business, which made his next words all the more surprising. "I'll read every word you write, Miss Ross," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of a promise. "If you're of a mind to write again." The unexpectedness of his offer left her momentarily speechless. Ethan Quinn barely knew her beyond polite nods exchanged at church socials or the occasional passing on Dalhart's dusty Main Street. She was merely the schoolteacher who'd arrived from Chicago 2 years prior, full of Eastern ideals and hope for a new beginning. "That's very kind, Mr. Quinn, but these letters," she paused, unsure how to explain, "were meant for someone else," he finished for her. "I understand that. But sometimes words need reading, even if not by their intended audience." With another tip of his hat, he continued past her to conduct his business with the postmaster, leaving Winifred standing in the doorway, the weight of his offer settling over her like an unfamiliar blanket, surprisingly comforting, despite its strangeness. The walk back to her small house on the edge of town gave Winifred time to consider Ethan Quinn's peculiar offer. The late September heat made the half-mile journey feel twice as long, but the physical discomfort provided a welcome distraction from her thoughts. Her home, a modest 2-room structure that came with her position as Dalhart schoolteacher, appeared on the horizon. The small porch with its single rocking chair offered little respite from the heat but served as her favorite place to grade papers and, more recently, write her unanswered letters. Once inside, Winifred placed the bundle on her small writing desk and untied the ribbon. 12 letters. 12 months of pouring her heart onto paper for James Blackwell, the charming cattle buyer who'd swept her off her feet, promised her marriage, then departed for his family's business in Boston with assurances he'd send for her within months. His subsequent silence had been deafening. The knock at her door startled her. The sun was setting, painting her small front room in amber hues. Visitors were uncommon, especially at this hour. Smoothing her skirts, Winifred opened the door to find Ethan Quinn standing there, hat in hand, looking as uncomfortable as she'd ever seen him. "Mr. Quinn," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "Is something wrong?" "No, madame," he replied, his eyes fixed somewhere over her shoulder. "I've come to apologize if I overstepped earlier. It wasn't my place to comment on your personal matters." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. Ethan Quinn was known for his straightforward manner and unwavering integrity, but not necessarily for social niceties. "There's no need to apologize," she said. "Your offer was unexpected but kind." He nodded once, seemingly satisfied with her response. "Well then, good evening, Miss Ross." As he turned to leave, Winifred found herself speaking without intending to. "Would you care for some coffee, Mr. Quinn? It's already brewed." The invitation surprised them both. For a moment he looked as though he might refuse, but then he nodded again. "That would be welcome, thank you." Inside, Winifred busied herself with pouring coffee, grateful for something to do with her hands. Ethan Quinn seemed to fill her small house with his presence, making everything around him appear delicate by comparison. "Sugar?" she asked, placing a cup before him at her small table. "No, thank you. Black is fine." They sat in awkward silence for a moment before Winifred gathered her courage. "May I ask why you made your offer today, Mr. Quinn?" Ethan took a sip of his coffee before answering, seeming to choose his words carefully. "My sister Martha wrote letters for 2 years to a man who never replied, watching her heart break piece by piece. Well, it struck me that perhaps having someone read those letters might have eased her burden somehow." "What happened to your sister?" Winifred asked softly. "Consumption took her last winter," he replied, his voice even but his eyes revealing the depth of his loss. "She was 25. "I'm sorry," Winifred said, meaning it. "That must have been difficult. Life out here is rarely easy, Miss Ross. But it's the unanswered things that haunt us most, I think." The simple truth of his words resonated with her. They finished their coffee in a silence that had somehow shifted from awkward to companionable. As Ethan rose to leave, he paused at the door. "My offer stands, Miss Ross. Should you ever need someone to read your words." After he'd gone, Winifred sat at her desk and, for the first time in months, reached for a clean sheet of paper. Her pen hovered over the blank page as she considered what to write and to whom. After a moment's hesitation, she began, "Dear Mr. Quinn, I find myself with words that need reading." The morning brought with it a fresh perspective and the realization that Winifred had actually written a letter to Ethan Quinn, not a love letter or even a particularly personal one, but a letter nonetheless. It sat sealed on her desk, and as she prepared for her day of teaching, she wasn't entirely certain she would deliver it. The schoolhouse was a short walk from her home, a one-room building that housed 27 students ranging from 6 to 16 years of age. Teaching was Winifred's refuge, the one place where her purpose felt clear and her heartache secondary to the needs of her pupils. "Good morning, class," she greeted as the last of the children filed in, their faces flushed from play in the schoolyard. "Good morning, Miss Ross," they chorused back, settling into their wooden desks with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Among them was 10-year-old Samuel Quinn, Ethan's nephew and Martha's son. The boy had his uncle's serious eyes and quiet demeanor, though grief had made him even more withdrawn in recent months. Winifred had made special efforts to draw him out, recognizing in his silence echoes of her own unspoken pain. "Samuel, would you please pass out the readers for the younger students?" she asked, offering him a warm smile. The boy nodded and set about his task with the same methodical care she'd observed in his uncle. The thought brought a flush to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the already warming classroom. The day passed in its familiar rhythm arithmetic for the older students while the younger ones practiced their letters, history lessons, a recitation from the McGuffey Reader, and finally, the ringing of the bell that signaled the end of the school day. "Remember your essays are due tomorrow," Winifred called as the children gathered their things. 2 pages on the importance of honesty, please." As the students filed out, Samuel lingered, clutching his slate to his chest. "Is everything all right, Samuel?" she asked, concerned by his hesitation. "Uncle Ethan said to give you this," he said, producing a folded piece of paper from his pocket. Winifred accepted it with a nod, waiting until Samuel had left before unfolding the note. The handwriting was strong and direct, much like the man himself. "Miss Ross, I would be honored to escort you to church this Sunday, if agreeable. E. Quinn." The simplicity of the invitation belied its significance. Church attendance in Dalhart was as much a social gathering as a religious observance, and being escorted was a clear indication of interest that would not go unnoticed by the town's eagle-eyed residents. Winifred carefully folded the note and placed it in her desk drawer. She had not delivered her letter to Ethan, unsure of what had prompted her to write it in the first place. Now, with his invitation, the dynamics between them had shifted yet again. Sunday was 4 days away. 4 days to decide whether to accept his invitation and what it might mean if she did. 4 days to consider what she truly wanted now that the fantasy of James Blackwell had been laid to rest with her returned letters. That evening, Winifred sat at her desk and reread her letter to Ethan. It was a simple expression of gratitude for his understanding, with a brief description of her journey from Chicago to Texas and her adjustment to life in Dalhart. Nothing that couldn't be shared, and yet it felt intimate somehow, perhaps because it was honest in a way her later letters to James never had been, filled as they were with increasingly desperate pleas for response. With sudden resolve, she tucked the letter into her reticule. Tomorrow she would deliver it to Ethan Quinn and accept his invitation to church. It was time to stop writing to ghosts. The Rocking Q Ranch lay 5 miles outside of Dalhart, a sprawling operation that was the envy of the county. Winifred had never had reason to visit before, but she found herself there the next afternoon, having hired one of the town's few carriages for the journey. The main house was larger than she'd expected, a 2-story structure of solid timber with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Several outbuildings and a bunkhouse for the ranch hands completed the central complex, with corrals and a barn visible beyond. As the carriage pulled up, a woman emerged from the house. Mrs. Gunderson, Ethan's housekeeper, a widow from Sweden who had come west with her late husband years before. "Miss Ross," she greeted with evident surprise. "Is something wrong at the school?" "No, Mrs. Gunderson," Winifred replied, stepping down from the carriage. "I've come to speak with Mr. Quinn, if he's available." "He's out checking the north pasture," Mrs. Gunderson said. "But he should be back soon. Would you care to wait inside?" Winifred followed the older woman into a spacious front room, furnished with solid, practical pieces that spoke more of comfort than fashion. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, though it lay cold in the September heat. "Can I offer you some tea?" Mrs. Gunderson asked, gesturing for Winifred to take a seat. "Yes, thank you," Winifred replied, suddenly aware of how impulsive her visit must seem. Left alone, she took in the details of Ethan Quinn's home. A bookshelf held a surprising collection of volumes, not just practical works on animal husbandry and agriculture, but also novels by Dickens and Twain, poetry collections, and historical accounts. On the mantel sat a daguerreotype of a young woman with Ethan's eyes and Samuel's smile. Martha Quinn. Surely. The sound of boots on the porch announced Ethan's return before he appeared in the doorway, his expression one of undisguised surprise at finding Winifred in his front room. "Miss Ross," he said, removing his hat. "This is unexpected." "I apologize for coming unannounced," she said, standing. "I received your note from Samuel and wanted to deliver my response in person." If Ethan was concerned about her answer, his face didn't show it. He simply nodded and waited. "I would be pleased to accept your escort to church on Sunday," she said, finding her voice steadier than she'd expected. "And I brought you this." She extended the letter, which he accepted with a slight furrow of his brow. It's not much, she explained. Just some thoughts I needed someone to read. Understanding dawned in his eyes. Would you like me to read it now? No, she said quickly. Later, when you're alone. Mrs. Gunderson's return with the tea tray saved Winifred from further explanation. As they sat with their tea, the conversation turned to safer topics: Samuel's progress in school, the weather, and the upcoming harvest festival. Samuel tells me you've been especially kind to him, Ethan said as Mrs. Gunderson left them to prepare dinner. I want to thank you for that. Losing his mother has been difficult for him. He's a bright boy, Winifred replied, quiet but thoughtful. His essays show remarkable insight for his age. He gets that from Martha, Ethan said, a brief smile softening his features. She always had a way with words. I'm more comfortable with horses than letters. And yet you offered to read mine, Winifred observed. Some things matter more than comfort, Miss Ross. The simple statement carried a weight that settled between them, creating a moment of connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. The clock on the mantel chimed 5, breaking the spell and reminding Winifred of the late hour. I should return to town before dark, she said, rising. I'll drive you, Ethan offered immediately. It's not safe for you to travel alone this late. Despite her protests that the hired carriage would suffice, Ethan insisted, and soon they were headed back to Dalhart in his buckboard, the hired carriage following behind with its driver. They traveled mostly in silence, the rhythmic clip of the horses' hooves and the creak of the wagon wheels providing a backdrop to their occasional comments about the landscape or a passing rider. As they neared town, Winifred found herself wishing the journey were longer. Will you read my letter tonight? She asked as they pulled up to her small house. Yes, Ethan replied, coming around to help her down from the wagon. And I'll have a response for you on Sunday. His hand lingered on hers a moment longer than necessary as she stepped down. A brief contact that sent an unexpected warmth through her despite the cooling evening air. Until Sunday then, she said, withdrawing her hand and moving toward her door. Until Sunday, Miss Ross. She watched from her porch as he drove away, wondering what he would make of her letter and why it suddenly seemed so important that he understand her words as no one else had before. Sunday arrived with clear skies and a crisp morning that hinted at the approaching fall. Winifred dressed with particular care, selecting a blue dress that brought out the deeper hues in her gray eyes and arranging her chestnut hair in a style more elaborate than her usual practical bun. The knock at her door came precisely at 9:30, giving them ample time to reach the white-clapboard church at the center of town before the 10 o'clock service. Ethan stood on her porch in a dark suit that transformed him from rugged rancher to distinguished gentleman, though his sun-bronzed skin and the calluses on the hand that helped her into his wagon spoke clearly of his daily labor. You look lovely, Miss Ross, he said simply as they set off. Thank you, Mr. Quinn, she replied, pleased by the compliment despite her resolve to maintain a proper reserve. You clean up rather well yourself. A hint of a smile crossed his face at her teasing tone. Mrs. Gunderson insisted on pressing this suit within an inch of its life. I think she's determined to see me respectably married off before she retires. The casual mention of marriage sent a flutter through Winifred that she immediately chastised herself for. One church escort did not a courtship make, especially when the man in question had only just read her first letter days before. I read your letter, Ethan said, as if following her thoughts. Twice, in fact. And? She asked, unable to keep the note of anxiety from her voice. And I'd like to read more, he replied. Your description of leaving Chicago, of seeing the prairie for the first time. It reminded me of things I take for granted. Relief and something like pleasure warmed her. I wasn't sure what to write, honestly. It's been so long since I wrote anything that wasn't addressed to him, Ethan finished when she trailed off. The man who returned your letters. Winifred nodded, grateful for his directness. Yes, James Blackwell. We were engaged, or so I believed. He was here buying cattle for his family's business in Boston. I remember him, Ethan said, his tone neutral. Flashy dresser. Talked a lot about Eastern refinements. Yes, that's James, Winifred agreed with a small, sad laugh. I was so taken with his stories of Boston society, of theaters and concerts and grand houses. It all seemed so exciting compared to teaching in a small town. And now, Ethan asked, his eyes still on the road ahead. Now I find I've developed an appreciation for simpler pleasures, she admitted, though I do still miss the bookshops. They reached the church before Ethan could respond, and the next moments were occupied with greetings and introductions as what seemed like all of Dalhart took note of their arrival together. Samuel appeared from the crowd of children playing in the churchyard, his serious face brightening slightly at the sight of his teacher with his uncle. Miss Ross, he greeted with a polite nod. Good morning, Samuel, she replied warmly. That's a fine new shirt you're wearing. The boy glanced down at his clearly Sunday best attire. Uncle Ethan bought it in Fort Worth last month. Says I'm growing like a weed. That you are? Ethan agreed, resting a hand briefly on his nephew's shoulder. Soon you'll be tall enough to reach the high shelves in Miss Ross's classroom. The service itself was unremarkable. Reverend Hollister's sermon on patience seemed particularly apt, though Winifred suspected he preached the same message regardless of his congregation's specific circumstances. What was remarkable was the sense of rightness she felt sitting beside Ethan, aware of his solid presence and the respectful attention he paid to both the service and to her comfort. Afterward, as was custom, the congregation gathered outside for socializing before dispersing to their Sunday dinners. Winifred found herself the object of curious glances and a few direct inquiries about her friendship with Ethan Quinn. Mr. Quinn was kind enough to escort me today, she explained to Mrs. Porter, the milliner's wife and one of Dalhart's most persistent gossips, as I don't have family in town. How thoughtful of him, Mrs. Porter replied with a knowing look that suggested she found the explanation insufficient. Though I must say, it's the first time I've seen Ethan Quinn escort anyone to church since he brought poor Martha before her passing. Before Winifred could respond, Ethan appeared at her side, having completed his conversation with several of the town's businessmen. Miss Ross, I was hoping you might join Samuel and me for dinner at the ranch, he said, his invitation clearly audible to Mrs. Porter, whose eyes widened with interest. That would be lovely, thank you, Winifred replied, trying to ignore the flutter of anticipation his invitation provoked. The ride back to the ranch was more animated than their journey to church, with Samuel in the back of the wagon occasionally chiming in with observations about his schoolmates or questions about the upcoming week's lessons. Winifred found herself relaxing into the easy conversation, struck by how natural it felt to be spending Sunday with Ethan and Samuel Quinn. Mrs. Gunderson had prepared a feast that spoke of her determination to impress: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, fresh bread, and apple pie still warm from the oven. The dining room, like the rest of the house, was comfortably appointed without being ostentatious, the table set with simple but good quality china. This looks wonderful, Mrs. Gunderson, Winifred said as they seated themselves, Ethan at the head of the table, Samuel and Winifred on either side. Mr. Quinn said to make something special, the housekeeper replied with a satisfied nod before returning to the kitchen. Conversation flowed easily through the meal, centered primarily on Samuel's education and his recent interest in the ranch's operations. Uncle Ethan's teaching me to rope, the boy announced proudly as they finished their pie. Says I've got a good eye for it. Your uncle is right, Winifred agreed. I've noticed how quickly you solve the geometric problems in mathematics. That requires a good eye for spatial relationships. Samuel looked surprised and pleased by the connection between his classroom and practical skills. Really, she confirmed. Many of the things you learn in school have direct applications to ranch life. Mathematics for calculating feed requirements and pasture rotation. Science for understanding animal health. Reading and writing for keeping records and correspondence. Speaking of correspondence, Ethan interjected as Samuel excused himself to help Mrs. Gunderson clear the dishes. I wrote you a response to your letter. From his jacket pocket, he produced an envelope and handed it to her. It's not as eloquent as your writing, I'm afraid. I'm sure it's perfect, Winifred said, accepting the letter with a surge of anticipation. Should I read it now? If you'd like, he replied, a hint of uncertainty crossing his usually confident expression. Or later, in private. Winifred hesitated only briefly before carefully opening the envelope. The letter inside was written in the same strong hand as his church invitation, but the contents were far more revealing. Miss Ross, your words about the prairie breathing like a living thing struck me deeply. I've lived here my whole life and never thought to describe it that way, though you've captured exactly what I feel when I ride out at dawn. You asked in your letter why I offered to read your words. The truth is, watching you stand in that post office with your returned letters reminded me not only of Martha but of myself. We all have things that need saying, even when the intended recipient isn't listening. I would be honored to read anything you care to write. And perhaps, if you're willing, I might try my hand at expressing thoughts I've kept to myself far too long. With respect, Ethan Quinn. Winifred looked up from the letter to find Ethan watching her, his expression carefully neutral. Thank you, she said softly, for understanding. Does this mean you'll write again? He asked. Yes, she promised. I'll write again. That night, Winifred sat at her desk and began a new letter, this one detailing her first year in Dalhart, the challenges of adapting to Texas weather, the gradual warming of the townspeople toward the Eastern schoolteacher, and her growing appreciation for the stark beauty of the landscape. She wrote more freely than she had in her first letter, allowing herself to include the small, personal observations that made her experience unique. When she finished, she sealed the envelope and set it aside for delivery the next day. For the first time in months, the act of writing felt like a release rather than a burden, a way of connecting rather than calling into the void. Over the next few weeks, a pattern emerged. Winifred would write a letter every few days, delivering it to Ethan either through Samuel or, increasingly often, in person during his visits to town or hers to the ranch. Ethan would respond with letters of his own, shorter than hers but thoughtful, revealing pieces of his life and thoughts with a careful honesty that touched her deeply. They wrote about their pasts, Winifred's childhood in a comfortable Chicago home with parents who valued education but not emotional expression. Ethan's early years on the ranch his father had established, the loss of both parents to fever when he was 18, leaving him to raise Martha and run the ranch alone. They shared daily observations, book recommendations, and gradually, their hopes for the future. What began as an unusual arrangement became something precious to them, both a way of knowing each other that transcended their increasingly frequent face-to-face interactions. On paper, they could express things that seemed too vulnerable for speech, building a foundation of understanding that deepened with each exchange. October brought cooler weather and the Harvest Festival, a community celebration that transformed Dalhart's Main Street into a festive gathering place with food, music, and competitions. Ethan asked Winifred to attend with him and Samuel, an invitation she accepted with an eagerness that no longer surprised her. The day of the festival dawned clear and crisp, perfect weather for the outdoor activities. Winifred wore a rust-colored dress that complemented the autumn theme, with a matching ribbon woven through her braid. When Ethan arrived to escort her, his appreciative glance made her cheeks warm in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. You look beautiful, he said simply, offering his arm. Thank you, she replied, taking it and feeling the solid strength beneath his jacket sleeve. Is Samuel joining us? He's already there with his friends, Ethan explained as they walked toward the town center. He's entered the pie-eating contest, heaven help us. Mrs. Gunderson has been training him all week. Winifred laughed at the image. I've noticed he has a hearty appetite at lunch. I think he has a good chance of winning. The festival was in full swing when they arrived, with booths selling crafts and food lining both sides of the street and a band playing lively tunes on a makeshift stage. Children darted between adults, their faces sticky with candy and excitement. Samuel waved to them from where he stood with a group of boys his age, looking more carefree than Winifred had ever seen him. He seems happy today, she observed. He is, Ethan agreed. He's been different these past few weeks. More talkative at home, more engaged. Mrs. Gunderson thinks it's because he's adjusting to Martha's absence, but I think it might also be your influence. Mine? Winifred asked, surprised. You've given him something to be interested in beyond his grief, Ethan explained. And perhaps seeing his dour uncle happy has helped as well. The admission that she made him happy sent a warm glow through Winifred. And are you? Happy? I mean, Ethan stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious but his eyes warm. Happier than I've been in a very long time, Winifred. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the intimacy of it in the midst of the festival's noise and motion created a moment of private connection between them. I'm glad, she said softly. So am I. The moment was broken by the announcement of the pie-eating contest, drawing their attention to the center of the street where tables had been set up. Samuel took his place among the contestants, his face set in determined concentration. $5 says he wins, Ethan said with a grin. I never bet against my students, Winifred replied primly. Besides, I've seen how much that boy can eat during lunch breaks. Sure enough, Samuel emerged victorious, his face smeared with blueberry filling and his expression one of triumphant satisfaction as he accepted the blue ribbon. The pride on Ethan's face as he congratulated his nephew made Winifred's heart swell with affection for them both. As the day progressed, they participated in various activities watching the horse races, trying their luck at the ring toss, where Ethan won a small porcelain figurine of a horse for Winifred, and sampling the various food offerings from town residents eager to showcase their culinary skills. When evening fell, lanterns were lit throughout the street, casting a golden glow over the festivities. The band began playing slower tunes, and couples moved to a cleared area to dance. Ethan turned to Winifred with a questioning look. Would you care to dance, Miss Ross? He asked, a hint of formality returning to his tone in the public setting. I would, Mr. Quinn, she replied with equal formality, though her smile betrayed her pleasure at the invitation. They moved onto the makeshift dance floor, Ethan's hand respectfully at her waist, hers on his shoulder. They were not the most graceful couple. Ethan admitted in a whisper that it had been years since he'd danced, but what they lacked in polish they made up for in genuine enjoyment of the moment. I received your last letter, Ethan said as they turned slowly to the music. The one about your engagement to Blackwell. Winifred tensed slightly. She had finally written about James in detail, how they met, his courtship, the promises made, and ultimately her gradual realization that perhaps his leaving had been a blessing in disguise. I hope it wasn't uncomfortable reading, she said carefully. No, Ethan assured her. It helped me understand you better, and I admire your honesty about how you've changed since then. I have changed, she agreed. The woman who was so eager to leave Dalhart for Boston barely resembles the woman I am now. And who are you now, Winifred Ross? Ethan asked, his voice low and intimate despite their public surroundings. I'm someone who appreciates what's real, she replied thoughtfully. Someone who values letters that receive responses and promises that are kept. Someone who has discovered that what looks plain at first glance often reveals depth and beauty upon closer examination. Like Dalhart, he suggested. Like Dalhart, she agreed with a smile. And its inhabitants. As the music ended, Ethan kept hold of her hand. Would you walk with me? There's something I'd like to show you. Curious, Winifred nodded, and they made their way through the crowd to the edge of the festivities. Ethan led her to a small park area behind the church, where the sounds of the festival were muted and the night sky spread out above them in a blanket of stars. It's beautiful, Winifred breathed, tilting her head back to take in the vast expanse. This is what I thought of when I read your description of the prairie, Ethan said, his voice quiet in the darkness. The sky out here, it's like nothing else. Makes a person feel small and significant all at once. Yes, exactly, she agreed, delighted by his understanding. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, gazing upward. When Winifred lowered her eyes, she found Ethan watching her, his expression one of tender contemplation. I have something for you, he said, reaching into his pocket. Something I've been carrying around for days, waiting for the right moment. He withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. It's not much, but when I saw it in Fort Worth last week, I thought of you. Winifred accepted the package with trembling hands, carefully untying the string and unfolding the paper to reveal a small leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with a simple pattern of prairie flowers. Ethan, she breathed, running her fingers over the soft leather. It's beautiful. I thought perhaps you might like a place to write things that aren't letters, he explained, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Things just for yourself. The thoughtfulness of the gift, not just its beauty but its recognition of her need for expression, moved her deeply. Without thinking, she rose on her toes and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek. Thank you, she whispered, for understanding what I need, even before I do. Ethan's hand came up to touch her face, his calloused fingertips gentle against her skin. Winifred, he said softly, I find myself in a peculiar situation. What's that? She asked, heart quickening at his touch. I've read your most private thoughts, and you've read mine, yet we've never properly courted, he said, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It seems we've done everything backward. Perhaps that's fitting, she replied with a small laugh. Since our acquaintance began with returned letters. Would you consider it? He asked, suddenly serious. Allowing me to court you properly? The question, though not unexpected given the direction of their relationship, still sent a thrill through her. Yes, she answered without hesitation. I would like that very much. His smile then was like dawn breaking over the prairie, slow, gradual, and ultimately transforming everything it touched. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away, Ethan leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss as gentle as it was profound. When they returned to the festival, hand in hand, neither noticed the approving glances and knowing smiles that followed them. They were too absorbed in each other and the unspoken promise of what their correspondence had begun. The weeks that followed brought a shift in their relationship. The letters continued, but now they were supplemented by regular visits, shared meals, and Sunday afternoons spent reading together on the ranch's wide porch when weather permitted, or before the fireplace when the November chill set in. Ethan began calling on Winifred several evenings a week, sometimes bringing Samuel along for help with schoolwork or simply for company. The boy flourished under the combined attention of his uncle and teacher, his grief still present but no longer all-consuming. As December approached, Winifred found herself thinking of the Christmas she'd expected to spend with James in Boston the year before, the grand parties and elegant gifts he'd described so vividly. The reality of her simple life in Dalhart, with school pageants to organize and modest presents to prepare, might have seemed disappointing in comparison, but instead felt genuinely satisfying. One evening, as she and Ethan sat before her fireplace, a companionable silence between them as they each read a book, Winifred found herself observing him with a sense of wonder. Here was a man who had never promised her opera houses or fine restaurants, who had instead offered something far more valuable: his attention, his understanding, his presence. "What are you thinking?" Ethan asked, catching her gaze. "That I'm exactly where I want to be," she replied honestly. His slow smile warmed her more than the fire. "As am I." Later that week, as December's first snow dusted Dalhart in white, Winifred received a letter that was neither from Ethan nor in her student's childish script. The Boston postmark made her heart stutter with recognition, and for a moment, she simply stared at it, unsure whether to open it or return it unread, a fitting irony she did not miss. Finally, with hands that trembled slightly, she broke the seal and unfolded the expensive stationery. "My dearest Winifred," began James Blackwell's familiar flowing script, "I write to you with the most profound apologies for my extended silence." The letter continued with elaborate explanations of family business troubles, a prolonged illness, and misplaced correspondence, excuses that might once have moved her but now seemed transparent and hollow. It concluded with an announcement that he would be returning to Texas on business in the new year and hoped to renew their understanding. Winifred read the letter twice, searching for any emotion beyond a mild curiosity at this intrusion from her past. Finding none, she carefully refolded it and placed it in her desk drawer. There would be time enough to compose a response, but first, she needed to share this development with the one person who had earned the right to read her most important words. The ride to the rocking queue the next day was cold but bright, the winter sun sparkling off the snow-covered landscape. Ethan met her at the door, his expression shifting from pleasure at her unexpected visit to concern as he noted her serious demeanor. "What's wrong?" he asked, helping her remove her heavy coat and gloves. "Nothing's wrong," she assured him. "But something has happened that I wanted to discuss with you in person." In the warmth of his study, a room she'd come to love for its comfortable disorder and the scent of leather and wood smoke, Winifred handed him James's letter. "This came yesterday." Ethan read it silently, his face revealing nothing until he reached the end. Then he looked up, his eyes searching hers. "And how do you feel about Mr. Blackwell's imminent return?" "Indifferent," she said honestly, "which surprises me somewhat. 6 months ago I would have been overjoyed. Now? Ethan prompted gently when she trailed off. "Now I understand what it means to be truly seen and heard," she finished. "Not just the version of myself I thought someone wanted, but all of me, my thoughts, my doubts, my hopes. You've read every word I've written, Ethan. Not just the pretty ones or the convenient ones, but all of them." He set the letter aside and took her hands in his. "I meant what I said that day at the post office, Winifred. I'll read every word you write, for as long as you're willing to share them with me." "I want to share all of them," she said softly. "Every word, every thought, every day." Understanding dawned in his eyes, but he didn't speak, waiting for her to continue. "I love you, Ethan Quinn," she said, the declaration both terrifying and liberating. "Not because you rescued me from unanswered letters or because you offered what James withdrew. I love you because you've shown me what it means to be truly known and still cherished." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise on the prairie, gradual, transforming, and ultimately brilliant. "I love you too, Winifred Ross. Have for months now, though I was trying to be patient." "I've never been particularly patient," she admitted with a small laugh. "I've noticed," he replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "It's one of the many things I love about you." Then he was kissing her, his arms drawing her close with a certainty that spoke of a future already taking shape between them. When they finally parted, Ethan kept hold of her hands, his expression suddenly serious. "I had planned to do this properly at Christmas," he said. "But since patience seems overrated today." To Winifred's astonishment, he went down on one knee before her, still holding her hands in his. "Winifred Ross, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? I can't offer you Boston drawing rooms or European tours, but I can promise to read every word you write for the rest of our lives, and to write back faithfully until my hand can no longer hold a pen." Tears blurred her vision as she nodded, unable for once to find the right words. "Yes," she finally managed. "Yes, with all my heart." Christmas in Dalhart that year was the most joyous the town had seen in recent memory, with the announcement of Ethan Quinn and Winifred Ross's engagement adding to the festive atmosphere. The school pageant, directed by the radiant teacher with her new gold band discreetly displayed alongside her engagement ring, was declared a triumphant success, particularly Samuel Quinn's recitation of A Visit from St. Nicholas, delivered with uncharacteristic animation. The January wedding, held in the town's white church and attended by nearly everyone in the county, was a simple but elegant affair. Winifred wore a cream-colored dress she'd ordered from a catalog and carried a bouquet of winter greenery with red berries. Ethan, resplendent in a new suit, watched her walk down the aisle with an expression of such undisguised adoration that several of the town's more romantic ladies were seen to dab at their eyes. Samuel served as ring-bearer, his serious face transformed by a proud smile as he played his role in uniting his uncle with his beloved teacher. Mrs. Gunderson, who had spent weeks preparing a wedding feast that would be talked about for years to come, beamed from her pew, her initial reservations about the schoolteacher long since replaced by genuine affection. As Reverend Hollister pronounced them man and wife, Ethan leaned down to whisper in Winifred's ear, "I'll read every word you write, Mrs. Quinn. That's a promise." "And I'll write volumes, Mr. Quinn," she whispered back. "That's a promise, too." The reception at the Rocking Q Ranch lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing and enough food to feed the entire county. As the last guests departed, leaving the newlyweds alone in the house that was now their shared home, Ethan drew Winifred into his study. "I have something for you," he said, retrieving a package from his desk drawer. Unwrapping it, Winifred found a beautiful mahogany writing desk, small enough to fit in the bedroom but exquisitely crafted. "For all those words you promised to write," Ethan explained. "I had it made in Fort Worth to your exact height. No more hunching over that old table in your house." "Our house now," she corrected gently, touching the smooth wood with appreciation. "Though I think this desk belongs here in your study." "Our study? You want to write here? With me?" he asked, surprised. "Where better?" she replied. "After all, this is where it all began, with you reading my words and writing back. It seems fitting that we should continue our correspondence side by side." Ethan's smile was answer enough as he drew her into his arms for a kiss that spoke of all the words they'd shared and all they had yet to write together. In the years that followed, life at the Rocking Q flourished. Winifred continued teaching until the birth of their first child, a son they named William, after her father. 2 years later, a daughter, Elizabeth, joined the family, followed by twins, Robert and Margaret, in what Ethan jokingly referred to as an unexpected literary development. Samuel grew into a fine young man who eventually took over management of the ranch's horses, developing a breeding program that became known throughout Texas. He never called Winifred mother, but the bond between them was no less strong for its unique foundation. True to their promises, Ethan and Winifred continued their written exchanges throughout their marriage. Sometimes these were practical notes about ranch business or household matters, sometimes lengthy reflections on books they'd read or events in their children's lives, and sometimes, most precious of all, love letters that spoke of a passion undimmed by familiarity. On their 25th anniversary, as they sat together on the porch of the ranch house watching their grandchildren play in the yard, Ethan presented Winifred with a special gift, a bound collection of her letters to him over the years, carefully preserved and now gathered into a volume. "You really did read every word," she said, tears blurring her vision as she leafed through the pages of her own handwriting, a chronicle of their life together. "And I kept my promise to write back," he replied, as she opened a second volume containing his responses. That evening, as they retired to the study that had become the heart of their home, Winifred took out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write, "My dearest Ethan, 25 years ago today, I stood before you and promised to be your wife. What I could not have known then was how that promise would unfold in joys and sorrows, in children's laughter and quiet moments by the fire, in words written and read with equal care. When my letters were returned unopened all those years ago, I thought my heart was breaking. Now I understand it was simply making room for a love far greater than I could have imagined. Thank you for reading every word. Thank you for writing back. Thank you for the story we've written together, one letter at a time. With all my love, today and always, Winifred," as she signed her name. Ethan's hand covered hers, warm and familiar. "I'll read your words for 25 more years," he promised. "And 25 beyond that if we're granted the time." "And I'll keep writing," she replied, turning her hand to interlace her fingers with his. "Every day, every word, just for you." Outside, the Texas sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, a fitting backdrop to the story that had begun with returned letters and a cowboy's promise, a promise kept through all the chapters of their lives, written together one word at a time.